Good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. I think Professor Welp actually did a good introduction to blockchain to set the stage on that. And for this topic here, we're going to go a little bit more deep dive into the blockchain ecosystem in Berlin and Singapore. And okay, before I start off the panel, Stanley, I'm from TechNode. So we are a tech media company from China. And I'm just going to run through the panel here, panelists real quick here, get them to do a quick self-introduction. So before we begin with the panel itself. Okay, let's start with Prakash.
Hi, my name is Prakash. I'm from X Squared. So we started out as a cryptocurrency miner here in Singapore, but we've evolved to being a crypto fund. We've participated in about 40 projects where we invest into projects at a pre-ICO perspective. And we primarily look at a lot of ecosystem building work here in the region. About 2 weeks ago, we curated the Singapore Blockchain Week, where we organize a range of events, brought the community together, and hope to evolve the industry collectively.
Hello, thank you for inviting me for this. I'm Chirdeep Singh Chhabra. I'm the founder of Ocean Protocol. Ocean Protocol is a decentralized data exchange protocol that enables data marketplaces to exist on top of it. You just heard the talk about digitization and so on. So everything digitization is all about data, and Web 2 has been all about data. So what we've seen is that been silos of data that actually are not shared, and AI is basically today in the hands of probably about 5 to 8 companies in the world. So our essential goal is to enable liquidity of data, to enable data to be shared in a way where data publishers have control of their data, and they're able to follow the regulation, and whether it is with personal data or otherwise, in a way that gives them full control, transparency, and so on. So that's what we are enabling. We are enabling this whole ecosystem of data sharing so that AI is in the hands of many and not in the hands of a few. Sorry, just a quick one. We are based between Berlin and Singapore, so I somehow sit in between.
Quite literally.
Yeah, literally.
My name is Nele. I run ICO Launchpad out of Berlin. And what that means is we help blockchain projects safely raise funds in a global fundraising event. So we do KYC AML. We gather all the funds and basically hand over the money in the end, being mindful of global regulatory frameworks and change of those, of course. As well as with a very strong focus on UX, because we really believe that if this whole technology is to become mainstream, we have to reduce a lot of friction that we still see. Ultimately, we want fundraising in the space to be as easy as paying with PayPal. That's the big vision. And on the side of that, we work on identity and payment solutions or the decentralized web that we think is the future. We're based mainly in Berlin with an engineering team in Porto, and we have a presence here in Singapore as well, enabled by the accelerator, the German accelerator, Southeast Asia. Hello there. And also enabled by strong partnerships with companies such as X Squared, for example.
Hi, I'm Ingo. I'm actually a long-term DLD affiliate. I worked for Border for 5.5 years as a CTO, and I founded my company together with Hubert Border Media. And the company is called BotLabs, and we're working on the KILT protocol. The KILT protocol is a blockchain-based protocol which enables, decentralized identity management and self-sovereign identity management, which ultimately leads to getting the data out of the big data silos and putting it back in the control of the people.
Hi, my name is Nick. I'm with Xane. We're a Berlin-based startup, and if I have no time at all, I usually tell people that we are a blockchain startup. In the end, we are a little bit more than that. We use some of the technical paradigms blockchain is bringing to us, e.g. Finding consensus and immutability of data, to work in the field of distributed intelligence. So distributed intelligence or distributed machine learning is about focusing the actual learning part into the devices instead of having a centralized cloud or computation system which is running in the background. And on the means of achieving distributed intelligent networks, we found a couple of hurdles we need to pass, and we might touch the topic a little deeper today.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to go through very quickly in the audiences here. How many of you are actually involved in blockchain projects? Show of hands. Oh, we got a good handful of them. And how many of you actually do invest in tokens or cryptocurrencies? So we got a fair bit here. Okay, so as the previous speaker, professor, has actually said, Singapore and Germany are one of the top few in this blockchain arena. And so I would like to start off by asking the panel here, how do we actually sort of differentiate the real blockchain projects these days, and what are those that are overhyped? So any one of you here would like to start?
Okay, I'll kick that off. I think one of the most important things with blockchain is or companies that are building anything to do with blockchain is, are they actually creating some base infrastructure technology that enables others? And the second most important thing is the ecosystem. So are there incentives placed so that the ecosystem can play within that, can use that infrastructure? It needs to be way beyond the element of trying to raise money or just trying to force a solution onto by using just another database. So I think these two elements form the basis of it. The ecosystem play is extremely important. One of the least talked about things about blockchain is the incentivization process that comes with it. And we at Ocean kind of emphasize that a lot. And I think that's an element that helps grow the ecosystem. That's an element that enables sustain a blockchain project. It's not just, especially if it's a permissionless system, and we strongly believe that just like the intranet died, an internet, which is an open system that's open, that anybody can actually plug into. Similarly, you'll have permissionless networks that will actually succeed, and for that, what you need to have is enable everybody to play and not have rules that keep people, a certain group outside and a certain group inside. This element of growing the ecosystem is extremely core to any kind of a successful project. I'll let others add to that.
So I guess there are two main things, right? There's a group of startups which are driving the innovation, and these are guys that are raising money through the ICOs that you hear about. And on the other end, there are the corporates, right, that are also now exploring how these technology can apply, whether it's in supply chain, whether it's in improving some aspects of their business. But what we are hoping to see a lot more is where the startups kind of work a lot more with the corporates, and that will kind of help us bring this adoption to a larger platform, and hopefully that will lead on to mass adoption. Because the startups, while they have raised a lot of money, they're still struggling from an adoption perspective. We're still only speaking to a very, very small percentage of the community. And unfortunately, the narrative has also been a lot on speculation. So the guys that are coming in, they just want to hold on the token and, get to dinner and talk about how many X returns that they've had. But in order for us to really get mass adoption, we actually need a lot more people participating. I think that's something that's still lacking in the ecosystem.
I think it's a lot about the game changes in the industry. Who can actually make a difference or take that step forward to make a change in the blockchain technology side? What about Ingo or Nell? Do you have anything to share in terms of how, say, for example, in Berlin or in Germany, how is it different from the Singapore market in this aspect?
I think the most successful projects anywhere right now, as we said, they focus on infrastructure. It's way too early to go very deeply into customer-facing applications. Like, we're still basically building HTTPS for a decentralized world. And no one knows where this is going to go exactly, and what is going to be the killer use case that suddenly makes the whole thing explode. And that's okay. And I think that's something that's important to emphasize. Use cases, mainstream adoption takes time, and we're still trying out a lot of things before we get there. And the projects that are successful anywhere, they know this. And they work in a very collaborative way. And what I think is very, very interesting about the Berlin ecosystem in particular is that there is a lot of collaboration. It's incredibly open. We have partners that we're working with who are actively looking to at least rent a desk in Berlin because they appreciate the openness and the knowledge sharing. It's a big shift from, yeah, I learned something, I'm going to keep it in-house, I'm going to be very protective of my knowledge, to open source approaches. And open source is really key to this whole development, and it's the number one thing that when we talk to projects that are looking to launch an ICO, that we send them back to the drawing board for, because they come back to us saying, oh yeah, well, I want my customers to pay me in tokens rather than in euros. Nothing of their approach changes, and we send them back saying, look, you need to think about open source, you need to invite your competitors to actually use your infrastructure, and that's hard, and it creates tensions, and it's definitely a different way of doing business tomorrow than you're doing now, but that's where the value is. And if you don't understand this, then even from a speculation point, it's not interesting to investors, but also it's really not the point. So that's where we're focusing right now when we're looking at which projects to launch. We're looking at infrastructure, and we're looking at who can build on top of stuff that is already there.
I can actually second this. For the European market, I've been looking into for a while now. It is really complicated. I find it really complicated to when I speak to business decision makers, actually, to explain them. If they want to be in blockchain today, it's not about really making one process inside their company better or better facing their customer. This is not the task right now. The task is think beyond your company, think your industry, think what can you do together with your competitors, actually. This is where the infrastructure for a blockchain comes in. It really doesn't make any sense to make a permissionless blockchain just for one company. That's completely nonsense. So what we do right now, as you say, is basically infrastructure. And infrastructure is a huge thing. Think about the infrastructure like 3G and stuff like that. The iPhone would never have happened without 3G or 4G. So this is a huge business. If you want to be in the blockchain business right now, and if you want to be successful, do infrastructure things, do them beyond your company. And this is very hard to think for people who were trained of thinking for the last 30 years, think your own company, how can I make more profit and stuff like that. This is not the case right now. You have to think beyond it and say, what can I do for the industry? How can I have an infrastructure where we can all together better serve our customers? This is what we have to think about now.
Maybe one point to add to that. I've had a really interesting talk with someone also in Singapore the week before during Consensus, and we were discussing the state of the blockchain and the maturity of blockchain itself. And the person said, in difference to what most people say, that the blockchain is more or less like the internet was in the 90s, he thinks that the blockchain currently is more in the 70s of things. We are, of course, developing in a much faster speed than the internet did, but still it's about building infrastructure, as Ingo just said. And I think to add to Nele's point, the Berlin ecosystem, I find it absolutely amazing. We had a blockchain week also in Berlin like 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it was becoming obvious how tightly connected all the different projects are actually in Berlin. And even if they have some fields which are pointing to the same direction, it's not about competing hardly with each other, but rather encouraging each other to build better and faster solutions.
Okay, to build on to this topic here, maybe we can have a little bit more perspective from the Singapore side, or from Chhabra, where you actually have Singapore and Berlin based. So can you share a little bit more about what's the difference in terms of the sentiments or the landscape in Berlin and in Singapore?
It's been quite interesting for us. So Ocean was basically created by two companies, one based in Singapore and one based in Berlin. So our partners, BigchainDB, have been one of the leaders in blockchain. They've been around for about 6 years. If you really talk to a blockchain company, usually they've been around for a year or two, and that experience speaks a lot. And they bring in that kind of experience and expertise there, where I think that talk about that openness in Berlin and so on, we've seen that. In fact, we have companies like Enigma, Rübe, and all of these guys actually come to our offices in Berlin and actually work from our offices. So they sit right next to our developers and see how we exchange ideas and sit and actually code together. That's amazing, because that actually shows what an open system and what an open infrastructure that we are trying to build. And from the Singapore side of things, we have seen a lot of openness from the regulators. We have seen a lot of openness from the industry. As DEX, we used to run a centralized data marketplace. When we pivoted to saying, you know what, the world of AI, data, and blockchain are going to come together, and we need to really go build the basic infrastructure for that to happen. And that led us to talk to the regulators here to say, we need to test this thing out. So we are running 7 regulatory sandboxes where we have signed up with the regulators here. So that is a huge achievement in terms of getting us right into the market, right into to the doors of the corporates to say how exactly we're going to work this together. Let's actually see how this can actually become a sustainable mechanism of sharing data. So in terms of that element from Singapore and that openness from Berlin has actually got us to make sure that we actually show that there is tech talent, there is that ability to actually engage with industry, with government, with the actual community, so that we can build the ecosystem on top of it. So and the track record of companies based in Berlin in terms of their ability to prove, or given that Ethereum actually built their first team there, it kind of attracted a lot of very interesting talent there. And similarly, the talent that Singapore has kind of brought in, where the government has kind of made sure that they actually are at the forefront of making sure that this economy actually is really at the cutting edge. And that has kind of made sure that we as Ocean have tried to make sure we bring both those elements together, and we hope that we continue to do that. And I think we've kind of taken the best of both worlds, and we feel very fortunate to have done that.
I think just to add on to that, so what we see from a fund perspective is that a lot of companies are actually looking at building a Eurasian strategy or a Pan-Asian strategy right from day one, where they're looking at coming to Asia not just to raise money, but also to build a market. And this, I personally feel, is very unique because in the traditional tech startup ecosystem, a lot of it's based on building it in your home market, and then you start looking regional before you actually start exploring Asia. And I think being able to build out a global strategy from day one, leveraging on the current opportunities that exist in the space is actually very beneficial. From a Singapore perspective, like what Chhabra said, from a regulatory perspective, the regulators have been very open-minded. There's no strict regulations with the intent that they want to encourage innovation to take place. And what it has now encouraged, that we're seeing a lot of top talent from Silicon Valley, from Europe, who are looking at actually coming to Singapore to set up their base because they feel that it's a place that is very comfortable. The regulators are not going to be enforcing things proactive or retrospectively. And that's kind of encouraging them to also look at setting things up and growing out of Singapore. The benefit that Singapore has traditionally has been the access to the region, not just Southeast Asia, but also to North Asia. And a lot of the funding in the space has actually been coming from North Asia. When bans came into China and Korea, a lot of projects actually flowed here to Singapore. A lot of the funds also started getting a lot more active in this part of the world. But in the blockchain space, I think we're starting to see the next chapter evolving. So we participated and got involved a lot with utility tokens, but I think the conversation on asset-backed or security tokens is very quickly coming into every conversation that we're in. And I think this is something that Europe and the US will probably lead in terms of actually coming out with actual regulation. The other aspect that we are also kind of looking at would be smaller jurisdictions out of Europe, which are becoming a lot more crypto-friendly. So we hear a lot about Malta, we hear a lot about Liechtenstein, and that's something that we're also exploring on how we could actually leverage. So the biggest challenge that we have here in Asia, or at least in Singapore, is getting access to banking, and that's something that we hope to slowly find solutions for by tapping into some of these up-and-coming crypto hubs and to kind of build out these flows through these networks.
Can I just add, I mean, when we talk about regulation, we are not saying that in any way, that there is less regulation or there's no implementation of certain regulations and so on. But there's absolute clarity on what that token really is. Is it a utility? Is it a security? That clarity helps us build the business. That helps us understand how we can actually sustain that model. And that made it easy for us to make that decision to actually base our foundation here in Singapore. And I think that clarity is what any business really looks for. I don't think any business looks for running away from any kind of regulation. Really.
And I think it's also necessary that there's some kind of consumer protection, because this I think it's a new asset class that we get here, which enables just the normal people to invest in technology, which we didn't have before. So it's really important what's happening here, and the customers have to be protected somehow. So you have to protect the normal people somehow, that they don't invest their money in companies which run off with the money. And I think that this is why we actually really need regulation, so it has to be trusted, because this is going to help the companies which invest the money in the real things and really bring the blockchain forward and bring technology forward and bring society forward, instead of giving the money to people who run away with it. So regulation is actually really necessary.
And since we already see a lot of steps forward in the field of regulation, this is also one of the reasons why the market is maturing over time. So you've been asking in the beginning, why are projects now more legit than maybe half a year ago? I think this is a big part of the puzzle.
Okay, so this brings the question about investing in blockchain projects. In terms of the relationship between blockchain projects, startups, and MNCs, big companies adopting blockchain, what do you see? And also, from the perspective of VCs, investors, traditional investors here, how do they correlate to that area? For blockchain, you have a lot of retail investors. It opened up this platform for a lot of retail investors to actually get involved in the blockchain projects itself. But is it more of like, we don't talk about speculation, but where should this investments or blockchain companies look to get funding from? Where should they be aligned in terms of their North Star?
Ultimately, they have to think about, who am I building for? Who is supposed to use my protocols? What is the benefit of it? And talk less about the short term, about valuations of tokens. All of this that's noise in an ICO. You want to reach out to whoever benefits from your technology. And that might be a huge corporate, it might be enterprise clients. I know that for Zane, there's a lot of large enterprise partnerships in place, and they make sense for what they're building. Or it might be that you're really looking to reach a mass market. There's social media projects. It makes no sense to run social media within 5 companies, right? You want wide adoption. So when you're planning for a fundraise and when you're looking at who to talk to, this should be the #1 focus. And we get a lot of questions about, oh, how can we reach the most people, or how can we reach the whales, and how can we incentivize people to spend. I think very often the projects that they're very worried about hitting their caps, and they're asking a bit of the wrong questions. It should always come back to, what is my use case? Where am I going with this? There's right now a trend to private sales. So last year, the 80-20 rule was 20% institutional money, 80% retail investors. This year, it's kind of flipped around. We think in the long term, and this is we saying people from Ethereum, people of Fractal as well, we think it's going to be somewhere around 50-50. Happy to have that number challenged as well. But when you're taking institutional money, it's important to think about why. It shouldn't just be a funding vehicle alone. There should be a strategic alignment that goes beyond, I need cash right now. That's really important. And there has to be an understanding of how those institutional investors think about their investments as well, and how I can incentivize them in the long term to actually stick around and support my project, and not just try and flip with maximum ROI in the quickest way possible. And that's not easy. That's difficult to do.
Exactly, because this is actually what we said before. We need in this, we need adoption of the whole thing. So the best blockchain project doesn't make any sense if it's not adopted by industry. So we need the big industry to adopt the stuff that we build as an infrastructure. And I think it's a good idea to couple that with an investment too. So if the people who are investing in those tokens and in your company are then responsible for getting it out in the market, this is actually the best thing that could happen. So I think it's a good trend that we go more to institutional investors, but that should not be pure financial investments, like getting out of it as soon as possible, and then the whole token breaks in shambles. We don't want that, actually. So it would be nice to have investors in those companies which really care about what they do and use the product, actually.
Mm-hmm. I think, Nele, you just said, happy to challenge that number. I think it's absolutely use case dependent. So I think we have consensus here that sometimes if I'm focusing on industry partners who should use some form of tokenization for whatever has been built, then it makes sense that you have a couple of big players handling the majority of the tokens. But if you are looking into a system where you're talking to customers, like C2C or B2C, then you're looking for much more distributed token. So yeah, this is my take on it.
Maybe I think it's important to bring up this question of why a company tokenizes, right? It's the ecosystem that then actually owns those tokens, that actually contributes to that ecosystem, that actually grows that ecosystem, uses that infrastructure, and enables everybody to actually gain from it, right? So that's the main purpose of tokenization. You can bring in investors from outside, but if the incentives are not aligned, I think people will actually see that their hands will, and everything around them will get burnt. Because if you have institutional investors come in who actually are there just to make money for their investors, obviously they will dump once they see that the price actually goes up. But the incentives have to be aligned, where if it is a utility token, if it is for the ecosystem to actually play and actually grow within that infrastructure and within that problem area, then those incentives should make sure that everybody rises with that. rather than have those misalignments where the large investors actually go and dump at some point in time, then the whole ecosystem kind of breaks away. So I think we have to be very careful when we say that that it's okay for institutional investors to actually come into projects. I mean, from our point of view, for example, we are more of a B2B play to start off with, but it might move to a B2C. But the thing is, ultimately, what matters over there is whether those who actually have tokens in their hands and the purpose, the mission, the values of that tokenized ecosystem are aligned or not. And if they are not, it'll fail. And I would actually love to see some kind of M&A happen in that area, and that will be an interesting kind of angle once that comes in. Just taking it back to this element of institutional investment and private investment coming in, I think it's I'd love to see where it'll go, but I have my reservations in terms of incentives, and I don't think they'll be aligned enough, and if they're not, then I think we are going to see a lot of money crash and burn.
I'd like to amplify something you said about playing. Outside of the investment and whose money should I take, I think you asked before, how can enterprise and startups work together, right? And I think this aspect of play and trying out things is really important, because we said it before, right now we're at the infrastructure layer. What the ultimate applications are is incredibly hard to predict, so all you can do is try out things. And this is not a new method, like Google design sprints and all this stuff has been around for a long time. It's still really, really hard to actually implement and execute against on an institutional level. I don't need to tell the people in the room, innovation in large enterprises is incredibly difficult. Keeping that open mind, like not going in with a specific end goal in mind, but just trying what comes out of brainstorms and trying 50 bad things, but then finding something really cool and really innovative is really important, to not lock ourselves in at this very, very early stage, like 70s of the internet, but to keep our minds open and explore and ultimately find what resonates with people.
I think to build on that point, startups can do a lot of innovation. They can move really quickly, and they can also break a lot of things. But there are two things that they don't have, right? One, they don't have an existing community. And many a times they are probably a new name or a new brand, which means that they lack trust in the marketplace. And a lot of startups, what they want to do in this space, they're trying to build a community very quickly, and also get money, right? We're trying to get the crowd to actually fund the particular project. And because last year what we saw was this hype, everything was rising very quickly. A lot of startups actually looked for shortcuts, right? They created artificial numbers. They used bots to kind of appear a lot bigger than what they really are. And why a lot of that is failing now is because you need real adoption, right? But if you look at the enterprise side, they have an existing community, and they have a lot of trust, right? So we saw that in the fintech space where startups recognize what they could bring to the table, and banks and insurance companies realizing that by actually collaborating, we go a lot quicker and faster. And we actually now need to start seeing that same amount of collaboration happening in the blockchain space.
Maybe to add to that, so we as Xane, we are almost exclusively working with industry partners, with enterprises. And one of the biggest hurdles we are facing is that it's not about building a vision with the customer or the potential customer and explain to them why a decentralized system can also be an advantage for them, but it's rather about that, what you always see when enterprises and startups collide, that the difference in pace they have, that this is facing a huge problem. I mean, we are waiting 6 to 9 months until an offer or proposal can get accepted or even gets to be discussed by procurement. And this is not because of lack of interest of our contact points, but rather because the old processes are the way they are. And what we're figuring out right now is that somewhere in the enterprises, they usually ask some champions who know which buttons to press and with whom to talk to accelerate that process. And I think as soon as this knowledge becomes more adopted also by the startups, I think then we can see actual cases of implementation.
So it's about creativity and innovation from the top down, as I would see from what you guys have shared here. So in the perspective of Berlin and Singapore here, how creative or innovative or ready to disrupt are the two different ecosystems here? There's a lot of similarities, I would say, but at the same time, there are unique differences in the two different countries. So maybe we can start off with a little bit more of the Asian context, Singapore here, and then we can have a little bit of a contrast from the Berlin side.
I think we're going through step-by-step growth here. We're starting to see a lot more institutional money coming into the space, traditional VCs setting up their crypto funds, and that's kind of encouraging more people to actually start participating in the space. The guys that are a lot more mature in the crypto space, a lot of their foundations are actually set up here in Singapore, and that's kind of helping get a lot more corporate participation. I think, looking at the BMW car here, BM in Asia works with VeChain, which is a good example that I can think of in this region, where they're kind of adopting a mature blockchain platform to actually implement it in some form within their ecosystem. But I think, there's still a long way to go. The other main area that we're also hoping to see a lot more adoption is actually from government agencies, because again, a lot of the blockchain protocols or solutions could solve a lot of the big challenges that governments are experiencing. One good case in point is recently our medical database got hacked, and a lot of private medical data was leaked. Again, if we can actually put that onto a blockchain, it could solve a lot of these pain points. We see a lot of startups actually trying to solve that, and hopefully the government explores working with one of these guys.
From the Singapore aspect, in addition to some of those aspects that you mentioned, there are programs like the Smart City program, which has huge backing, but also it's a small place where you have so many headquarters of so many MNCs. So the focus over here always is the practical aspect of getting to move and actually to move the needle. And I think that's an amazing aspect of Singapore. It's something which I think, for example, Berlin lacks, where I think there aren't large corporate headquarters in Berlin. They're a little away. The mentality also is more actually to build stuff, not actually to. There isn't that much big of a mentality to actually go and sell stuff. So I think bringing those two worlds together for us has been an amazing thing, because I think it's like I said, the best of both worlds. We have the dreamers and the those who actually want to change the world, sitting in Berlin. And we have, Singapore, which, actually wants to work with the world, wants to trade with the world, wants to actually make sure that we have the right kind of ecosystems to actually change the way or increase the pace of change and innovate faster. And to be slightly ahead of the game. And I think bringing those two worlds together has been an interesting aspect for us. It does bring about some interesting elements to think about in much more detail. But for example, even though there are so many blockchain companies in Berlin, BaFin, the regulator there, has been very slow in terms of even clarifying whether a certain token is a utility token or not, and so on. So in spite of that, you have those companies operating from Berlin. I think these two aspects, I think joining them together really kind of completes the story. It makes it really 360 degrees.
Also an interesting question would be how many of the companies sitting in Berlin are also registered in Berlin. So the topic of setting up a foundation, if you are looking into open sourcing your IP. I know about quite a lot of companies who are sitting in Berlin but have their vehicle based somewhere else, maybe in Malta, maybe even in Singapore, maybe as a Dutch Stichting in the Netherlands or in Luxembourg. So I think there's also a huge difference when it comes to setting up these structures.
Yeah, and a joint effort from a European perspective in giving clarity and in unifying the regulatory framework would be very much appreciated, I think, because right now you have this weird situation of kind of regulation arbitrage, where you try to cherry pick the right jurisdiction in just the right moment, do your ICO really quickly and hope you get away with it. Not because people want to break the laws, but because things change so quickly and you have very, very little security in the long term. Germany makes it very hard, and that's not a blockchain topic, that's just generally setting up a company is a nightmare. Closing a company is a nightmare too, by the way. There's not a lot of trust in being able to keep your bank account and reliably exchange crypto to fiat. There are some banks in the space and they're very active, but there's not an outspoken commitment to this ecosystem right now where you say, okay, for the next 5 years, the way that Singapore has done, we are giving you the legal safety to just try stuff out without threatening to lock your funds or get you in legal jeopardy. And that's a problem because without some kind of planning certainty, you can't build for the long term, and that's what we're trying to, or at least that's what the legitimate projects are trying to do at the moment. And the more proactive, we're asking for regulation. This is something that is incredible. Everybody is going out and saying, please tell us what to do, tell us how to be compliant, so we can focus not on paying our lawyers every 2 weeks to figure out if we're still in the clear, but we can build our protocols.
Yeah. Maybe I can add something positive to that, which would be, I think Berlin has been very fortunate to have huge projects actually out of Berlin, like Ethereum was developed in Berlin, and that produced a lot of brain actually, because there were good people and they also had some money then. And brain always attracts new brain, so we got a lot of new companies because of that, and that attracts, at least from Europe, a lot of blockchain brains. So I think Berlin is heading towards at least the blockchain capital of Europe, which is actually very good, because you asked for creativity. I think the creativity is really great. So we have this legal framework which could be improved somehow, but where there are possibilities to get out of it and go to other countries and go to Singapore, which is actually not in the best interest of the German or the European states. They should move a little bit faster. And I also find it very annoying, like if you want to make an ICO in Germany completely and really be by the law, you can invest like $400,000 or euros alone for tax people and lawyers to get it right and get it straight. And this is not how it should be, because we're talking about startups. 400,000 is a lot of money for them.
And this paying all this money and not being entirely sure if you are compliant. I mean,
and then you're not sure even.
Yeah, because we're still in the phase of finding all the rules. So.
Okay, so in this aspect, like this question that I think we all know that blockchain is decentralized, right? And as of traditional businesses, like how these big companies actually consolidated these technologies or this skills to make it available or easier for mass adoption. Do you think that blockchain technology in itself requires some sort of consolidation before it can actually be done in a mass adoption? Or what is the trend between like Berlin right now and in Singapore? Do you see this blockchain technologies being adopted, and are these big companies the ones that are pushing for it? And is it should be done this way?
So maybe let me start from a Singapore Asian perspective. I think last year we saw a lot of protocol projects, coming about, and everyone was talking about transactions per second and how each project was going to be a lot faster, But the reality was, yes, we were in that infrastructure building level. A lot of these investments was required. But what we're starting to see a lot more now, what we call reverse ICOs, where more mature companies are actually building upon the protocols so that we can actually look for more good use cases. I think the narrative is kind of shifting away from decentralization for the sake of being decentralized, but now to how we can actually leverage the technology, leverage the platform to actually bring value to the consumers, bring value to the corporates, and then start that process from that aspect. So I'm starting to see that shift in a big way.
I would second that. So, just building or just selling blockchain just for the sake of it, and saying that it's almost like looking, you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and just seems like 95% of the projects that you see out there are basically that. And I think when we talk about mass adoption of a certain technology, I think we are starting to ask the question from the wrong angle. It's not the technology that needs to get sold; it's what needs to get sold is the benefits of it. It's almost like I'm asked this question: how do I explain blockchain to my mom? And I'd rather say that do not, because you have not actually gone ahead and told her how any other database actually works. You do not go and explain to your mom how SQL databases work. You shouldn't have to. Right? So if you can show the benefit of that, then that is what you actually go and sell, and that is what will bring about mass adoption. So I think there is also this element of, I think, with a lot of money floating around, and once a lot of organizations have money, they actually stop thinking about the customer, and there's a lot of that happens, which is not thinking about the customer but building for yourself. And I think it works to a certain extent, but I think we need to kind of understand who the customer is and make sure that it is easier for them to use. I mean, if you really look at projects like Linux and so on, which are open source today, 95% or 90% of systems are run on some form of Unix or Linux. It's because the adoption actually reached there by making it easier to use. Companies like Red Hat decided they're going to make it easier for corporates, easier for enterprise, rather than actually just make it for developers. So I think those kind of thought processes are important, where you actually are building for your customer, you're making it easy for them to integrate, and they don't have to jump hoops to try and spend 4 days with you to actually just understand the technology, and then spend the next year trying to see how to bring it into their system without even knowing what that will actually do to their what benefits it will bring to them. So I think the conversation needs to start from a different angle.
Agreed, and this is something that I find very interesting when I try to hire people. Is I approach people that are technologically literate, that have worked with complex setups, and like, I'm not an engineer. I've worked in ad tech. When I try and convince people that they should come to the dark side of blockchain, they get really intimidated, because I don't know, as an ecosystem, I think we have cultivated an image that it requires a high technological literacy to even get started in the space, and I don't think that's true, because I really believe that explaining what this is about is just as important as building for it. You need engineers as much as business people, as much as people who are experts at communicating benefits, and we need to be better making that clear.
Yeah, I think communication is really key to it, because when I always have the feeling that everybody heard about blockchain, and the CEO heard about blockchain. Then he goes to the CIO and says, we have to make a blockchain project in our company. And then the CIO says, okay, blockchain project. Which process can I make better? Because CIOs always make a process better. And then they go to IBM or to Accenture and just buy something which is a permission blockchain, and they bought a software. They could easily have bought SAP or SQL database and done it with that, but they do it with a blockchain, and then everything's fine because they did a blockchain project. But this really didn't bring the world one step further. And this is a huge problem we have, because behind the those permission blockchains, we have huge companies like IBM and Accenture, and they have communication channels into the companies, and they use them. And this is just misleading. It leads away from what we are doing, what the serious blockchain companies are actually doing. And so we have a huge communication problem because we actually create much bigger value, but we are much more silent.
What about Nick?
I think most of the points have been made. I think what I would call a temporary success if industry partners would fully understand that blockchain is not going to be something sexy in a small black dress where I push a button and something magical is going to happen, but rather it's going to be actually maybe pretty boring backbone, an IT backbone, which is just enabling a couple of use cases which have not been able before. Maybe data trading between enterprises, maybe big data marketplaces. These are the technologies of the future, and our current IT systems are maybe capable of doing that, but not in a secure manner. And I think to put a price tag on security is currently really hard to do. But I think that we are in the means of understanding that. That's at least what I'm perceiving from the industry partners. And I think as soon as we understood that as a community building around blockchain technology, I think then we will see broader or mass adoption.
Okay, I think we're running out of time here. And whatever we've shared here, do we have any questions on the floor here that you guys want to ask? Yes, sir.
Hello. Thank you, panel, for your insights. As we were talking about consolidation of different blockchains, I want the panel to shower some light on how can a layer of maybe intercommunication between different blockchains, like a logistics supplier has a different blockchain and the supplier or the manufacturer has a different blockchain. If these two blockchains can communicate amongst themselves, then I think it adds more value to the end consumer. And is the blockchain technology in its current state ready for this intercommunication or consolidation, or there's something more in the future, maybe a blockchain 2.0 or something in the DAG sector? Thank you so much.
Well, there's some project going on in this field. I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that everything is ready and you can use it. This is a piece of the infrastructure which is still actually missing. But you can look at, for example, Polkadot, which is also from our friends in Berlin. And that, for me, this looks very promising. And you can build blockchains on this framework, or it's based on a framework, and you can use the same framework, and then those blockchains can intercommunicate. And that would be one solution, but there's probably many solutions out there, and we don't know who will win. But it looks like a lot of people are working on that, and we will have that solved, but it is not solved. This is one of the infrastructure things missing.
And it's a typical process of standard setting, right? Like there's no central entity deciding that it's one standard that wins. You will have a lot of competing projects, and they will have benefits and they will have drawbacks, and ultimately what gets used is what is implemented by developers. It's the projects that reach out to communities, that make sure that their benefits are understood, and that support the people building on their infrastructure. It's Sony Betamax all over again. We will have standardization and we will have intercommunication. There's projects who work on connecting blockchains, and some projects will also die, and that's okay. But there's no either or. It's the very dissatisfying answer of it depends, as usual, right?
Well, I think consolidation is definitely going to happen at some point in time here. It's just how these blockchain projects actually do, once again, communicate, and of course with the enterprise coming into play here. So any more questions here? Yes.
Quick one. So the blockchain has been frequently compared to the internet, and as we know, like TCP, IP, SSL, packet switching, those are all worth zero as a protocol. It's about the custodians on the end and the apps that are creating the solutions on top of it. So with this paradigm, is the inherent value of a protocol zero, and it's more important about the apps and the service providers on the ends? And if that's the case, is that where investment should go, and that the ICOs are basically, fictitious?
I wouldn't really say that. I think there's a discussion about FAT protocol and thin application and thin applications and FAT protocols. I think what we have seen with what TCP/IP really enabled was companies to build massive platforms on top of it and collect data on top of it, right? So essentially, we didn't realize that suddenly there are these massive platforms, these silos that actually own all our data. And what we are going to see with the blockchain technologies in that way is we're going to have some massive protocols that will enable applications on top of it. But then the addition, so when you actually say there's going to be a zero value to the protocol, the reality of what will happen now is once these are tokenized, they actually enable that ecosystem to grow where everybody actually wins. It's not just a few applications that actually can gather data. They're the only ones who win. So that's going to be the difference here. And that is why, when we say that we want to make sure data to be in the hands of many, AI to be in the hands of many, I think this whole element of when you actually have a protocol that actually enables that kind of tokenization to happen, enables the entire ecosystem to be part of it, and to grow together with it, I think that's the difference that you will see in this new internet era that's coming.
Yeah, I think maybe I add to that, but just as a simple example, HTTP, okay, what's the value of HTTP? You don't pay to Tim Berners-Lee if you use HTTP. But on the other hand, look at the protocol like the Bitcoin protocol, which is a protocol. It created hundreds of billions of dollars in value over the last 10 years. So there is a certain value. The difference is only before that it was just open source, and now it is open source where everybody can invest by buying one of the coins. So I think we brought value to the protocols.
Okay, I think, once again, thank you very much to our panelists here for sharing this. And I think we can all agree that blockchain is going to stay, in terms of the speed that the growth of it is going to only accelerate in the next 5 to 10 years here. So once again, thank you very much for joining us on this panel.